It begins in the quiet corners of England, in a place where life moved at a gentle pace, where the days were marked not by grand events but by the simple routines of ordinary people. Highbridge, in Somerset, an unassuming town in the late 1800s, with its narrow lanes and chimneys sending thin threads of smoke into the cool morning air. It was there, on the 24th of November in 1884, that a small child came into the world. His parents named him Frank Edward Foley. No one could have guessed, not even in their wildest dreams, that this child would one day stand between thousands of families and the greatest darkness humankind had ever known. Young Frank grew up quietly. He was not a boy who commanded attention. He walked softly, listened carefully, and thought deeply. Teachers noticed that he had an unusual calmness about him, a stillness that made him seem older than his years. While other children rushed through lessons, Frank lingered on words, on phrases, on the delicate music of language. French, German, Latin, these tongues fascinated him. He would sit at his small school desk, tracing letters with his finger, as though each one carried a secret waiting to be uncovered. Perhaps even then, life was preparing him for the work he would one day do, though he could never have imagined how. A thin young lad with bright, steady eyes, walking home along a dirt road, passing hedges humming with late summer bees, his mind full of foreign words. He came from a modest family, nothing extraordinary, nothing grand. His parents were practical people who valued discipline, honesty, and quiet dignity. They encouraged his education, knowing that the world was changing and that a sharp mind would be a valuable companion in the years to come. When Frank grew older, he pursued his studies with seriousness. He attended Stonyhurst College, a Jesuit institution known for rigorous scholarship and moral discipline. There, his love for languages deepened. He became fluent in French and German, not merely through memorization but with genuine delight. He had a gift, you see, a way of absorbing the subtle structures of speech, of hearing meaning beneath sound. His teachers recognized this talent. Some even said, "This young man has a mind built for delicate work." And delicate work is exactly what awaited him. When the First World War erupted and swept across Europe like a storm tearing roofs from houses, Frank, like so many young men, joined the British Army. But he served not as a man drawn to glory or adventure. He served with the same quiet resolve that had marked him since childhood. He became an officer in the Hertfordshire Regiment. He learned discipline, patience, and the heartbreaking cost of conflict. He saw the destruction of towns, the shattering of families, the long lines of weary soldiers returning from the front. And somewhere in those years, something inside him hardened, not into bitterness, but into conviction. A conviction that life is fragile, and that those who can protect it must. His gift for languages did not go unnoticed. Intelligence officers saw potential in him, a man who could blend into a crowd, listen without drawing attention, and absorb details with calm precision. After the war, he was recruited into the British intelligence services, what the world would later know as MI6. It was a world of secrets, invisible dangers, and quiet chess games played in the shadows. And Frank slipped into it with the ease of a man who had finally found work that matched the rhythm of his soul. His assignment eventually took him to Berlin. He arrived there during the years when Germany was trying to stand again after its devastating defeat in the Great War. The 1920s in Berlin were a strange mixture of brilliance and despair. Streets lined with cafes full of artists and writers, theaters dazzling with new ideas, and yet just beneath that glitter lay poverty, unrest, inflation so terrible that people carried wages home in wheelbarrows. And into this volatile landscape walked Frank Foley, officially appointed as the passport control officer at the British consulate. Passport control officer. The title sounds dull, even trivial. A man who stamps papers, checks photographs, and listens to weary travelers explain why they need to cross a border. But in truth, this title was nothing more than a mask, a curtain drawn over the real stage. For behind that door, in the quiet back rooms of the consulate, Frank Foley conducted the serious work of intelligence gathering. He watched the political tides shift. He observed extremist groups rising like dark waves on the horizon. He sent reports back to London, careful, precise, always measured. He was good at his work, very good. Not because he was cunning or deceptive, though he could be when necessary, but because he remained calm, steady, and unflappable. As the 1920s melted into the 1930s, Germany became a crucible of anger and desperation. The economy crumbled. Unemployment soared. And in this environment of fear, a man named Adolf Hitler found the perfect stage. With rousing speeches and iron certainty, he promised a wounded nation a path back to greatness. Frank watched this rise with wary eyes. He knew how extremism grows, quietly at first, then with shouts, then with marching boots. When Hitler finally rose to full power in 1933, Frank understood that Germany had stepped into a shadow from which it might not easily return. It was in these years that Jewish families in Germany first felt the cold fingers of persecution tighten around them. At first, it was subtle. A new law here, a restriction there. A shop vandalized. A newspaper headline dripping with hatred. But soon the pace quickened. Jewish professionals were forced out of their jobs. Jewish children were separated in schools. People who had once felt fully German, who had served in the army, who had built businesses, who had lived peacefully for generations, suddenly found themselves treated as enemies. And this is where Frank's path took its most remarkable turn. From the windows of the British consulate, he saw men and women entering the streets with uncertainty etched into their faces. He saw families trying to navigate new laws designed to trap and suffocate them. And before long, these families began arriving at his door. They came humbly, timidly, with worn documents and trembling hands. Some had heard whispers that the British visa officer was kinder than most. Others came because they had nowhere else to go. Frank listened. He listened to every story. Stories of lost jobs, of children bullied, of homes defaced, of livelihoods stripped away. He listened to fathers speak through clenched jaws, mothers speak through tears, and children speak through silence. And something deep within him responded, not with outrage, but with compassion sharpened into resolve. Britain's immigration rules were strict. There were quotas, conditions, long processes meant to slow the flow of refugees. But Frank saw these rules as obstacles he could bend, stretch, or in moments of necessity, quietly ignore. A man of rules became, paradoxically, a man who understood when rules must be set aside for the sake of humanity. He began issuing visas more freely than the guidelines allowed. He signed documents late into the night. He expedited applications that others would have delayed. He took risks, small at first and then greater. He helped people who arrived at his door with nothing but hope clasped in their hands. And gradually, the quiet man behind the desk became a lifeline. Berlin at this time grew darker each month. Nazi propaganda poured through the streets. Parades of soldiers marched beneath banners emblazoned with the swastika. Jews were beaten, arrested, humiliated. People disappeared without explanation. The world watched uneasily, unsure of what to do. But in his modest office, Frank continued, page by page, signature by signature, to push back the tide. And then came a night that shook Germany to its bones, Kristallnacht. The night of broken glass. In November 1938, a wave of orchestrated violence swept across Germany. Mobs shattered Jewish shop windows. Flames engulfed synagogues. Homes were invaded, furniture smashed, families dragged into the cold night. The streets the next morning glittered with shards of glass like ice on a winter river, beautiful only from a distance, deadly up close. In that terrible aftermath, thousands of Jewish men were arrested and taken to concentration camps. It was meant to break their spirits, to convince them that life in Germany was no longer survivable. And it was then, in these desperate hours, that Frank Foley's courage stepped out of the shadows completely. While others stayed indoors, trembling or pretending not to see, Frank went straight to the camps. He walked past guards, past officers, past men intoxicated with newfound authority. He demanded the release of prisoners who had British entry permits or who could obtain them. Some guards refused. Some tried to intimidate him. But Frank always remained calm, polite, unwavering. His quiet certainty rattled them more than anger could have. One by one, men walked out of the camps because of him. Alive. Saved. Returned to their families. This was only the beginning. You see, in those days, Berlin was a city where fear walked openly in the streets. People spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders as if darkness itself had grown eyes. Shopkeepers who once greeted customers with warm smiles now pulled down shutters early, their faces painted with quiet dread. A city does not change overnight, but fear? Fear is a sculptor, and it works quickly. And in the midst of that world, there was Foley, stepping each day into the British passport office as if it were any other ordinary job. The casual observer would never suspect that behind those calm blue eyes was the heart of a man carrying more moral weight than most armies. No uniform. No medals. Just a small office desk, a fountain pen, and an unwavering conviction that human dignity was worth defending. He arrived each morning precisely at the same time, never early, never late, because drawing attention was the enemy. His hat worn just so, his overcoat neat but unremarkable. He carried himself like a man determined to fit the background of a photograph. For anonymity was his greatest shield. Yet every day, he pushed that anonymity to the brink. The queue outside the consulate told its own story. Long faces. Red eyes. Hands clutching documents like lifelines. Families, young couples, elderly men leaning on trembling canes, all waiting with fragile hope. Some traveled days to reach that doorway. Some came after selling heirlooms, furniture, or even the coats on their backs. Anything, if it meant buying a chance at life. Inside, Foley would invite them to sit. He listened. Always listened. He did not rush them, even when the line curled down the street like a serpent. It wasn't paperwork to him, it was the preservation of futures. He sat one day with a young mother, Ruth, her name was. Her baby lay sleeping in her arms, wrapped in a frayed shawl. Her husband had been arrested the previous night for nothing more than being who he was. She spoke with trembling breath, her words spilling out like shattered glass. "Please, sir. I don't know where else to turn." Foley simply nodded, with a gentleness that was almost disarming. "We shall see what we can do," he said softly. And those words, said in that tone, were often the first moment of hope his visitors felt in months. He picked up her paperwork, incomplete, disordered, the sort that any other official would stamp rejected. But Foley studied it with earnest concentration. His finger traced each line, each missing field, and then quietly, without a word, he began to complete the required details himself. He worked with the meticulous care of a watchmaker repairing a delicate mechanism. When he was done, he did not push the papers back. He simply looked at the baby, then at the mother, and issued a visa. Just like that. No hesitation. No theatrics. Just quiet compassion wrapped in bureaucratic ink. And when the woman realized what he had done, she cried. Not loud sobs, no, it was the soft trembling of someone who had been holding themselves upright for far too long. Foley simply offered her a handkerchief, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. But the world always returns. After she left, Foley stepped into the hallway. A pair of German officers lingered near the entrance, their voices low, their eyes sharp. Berlin was becoming more suspicious by the day, and Foley knew it. They greeted him with forced cordiality, the kind that dripped with veiled curiosity. "Busy day, Mr. Foley?" one asked, his smile taut. Foley returned a polite nod. "Oh, paperwork has its way of multiplying," he replied with that mild British understatement that made him so difficult to read. The officer's eyes narrowed, a hunter momentarily unsure of the prey. But Foley walked past calmly, as though completely unaware of the storm gathering around him. Because that was his gift. He carried danger as if it were merely another document to file. Night, however. Night brought different challenges. You must imagine the city then, lamps dimmed, alleys washed in a ghostly pallor. A place where footsteps echoed louder than they should, and whispers carried unnaturally far. Night was when Foley did work that no official title could ever justify. He visited safe houses. He delivered documents under the cloak of darkness. He met with families hiding in cramped basements, their breaths shallow, their eyes desperate. Once, he found himself in an attic beneath a leaky roof. Rain pattered against the fragile wood, dripping down into rusted tins placed beneath the cracks. Inside were 4 souls huddled together, a father, mother, and 2 boys no older than 10. The father stood as Foley entered, his posture stiff with fear. The mother held the boys close, their small chests rising and falling with the uneven rhythm of panic. Foley lifted a hand, offering reassurance. "I'm a friend," he whispered. "Please, sit." The moment calls for calm. He reached into his coat and produced 4 documents, visas prepared earlier that day, each stamped with a future. The father's hands shook as he took them. He didn't speak, couldn't speak. Instead, he pressed the papers against his chest and let out a broken sigh, the kind that releases months of silent torment. And Foley? He simply asked them their travel route, adjusting the plan with surgical accuracy. He marked safe checkpoints, noted risky roads, and gave them the times when patrols were lowest. He did it with the precision of a general planning a military escape. Because that is exactly what it was, a war fought in whispers. Before leaving, one of the boys tugged at his sleeve. "Sir," the child murmured, "you scared?" Foley knelt, eye level with the boy. "Of course I am," he said. "Being brave doesn't mean being without fear. It means doing what must be done despite the fear." The boy nodded, as if receiving a secret meant only for him. And Foley slipped out the back window before dawn, disappearing into Berlin's labyrinth of dim streets. Every sunrise found him at his desk again, the day's entire clandestine work erased from his expression. He was unreadable, a closed book, except for a faint look in his eyes when he saw someone walk into the consulate already holding hope in their hands. But the danger grew. The Gestapo began tightening its grip. Files were reviewed more carefully. Border checks became stricter. And rumors circulated, whispers of a British official who was too helpful, too lenient, too eager to approve visas. Foley felt the pressure closing around him. Not overtly. Not yet. But in the subtle ways a predator circles before pouncing. One morning, an officer entered the consulate, asking questions with that delicate menace so typical of the era. "Certain irregularities have been noted," the officer said. "Names leaving Germany faster than expected. Documents approved with remarkable frequency. We are simply curious." Foley responded with impeccable serenity. "Well, you know how paperwork behaves," he said lightly. "It never quite follows one's expectations." The officer studied him, but Foley offered nothing, no twitch, no tell, no slip of expression. He had the composure of a marble statue. When the officer finally left, the consulate breathed again. But Foley understood something vital. The window of opportunity was closing. He knew he had to work faster. More discreetly. He knew each passing day meant fewer chances, more danger, more scrutiny. And yet, he did not falter. He worked later into the nights. He bent rules until they were unrecognizable. He authorized documents for individuals who by every bureaucratic standard should have been rejected, the elderly, the poor, the unconnected, the undocumented. To Foley, there was no hierarchy of worthiness. Every life was deserving. And so the line grew longer. Word spread quietly, like a candle passed from hand to hand. If you can reach the British consulate, if you can speak to the man with the calm voice, the one who looks at you like he truly sees you, you might have a chance. That was how people described him. Not by his name. Not by his title. But by the way he made them feel seen, at a time when the world had forced them into invisibility. One particularly cold evening, Foley met with a group hidden in a cellar beneath an abandoned print shop. The air was thick with dust and ink from machines that once clattered with life. Now, the machines lay silent, mute witnesses to the trembling gathering. There were 7 of them. A scholar, a tailor, a violinist, a young woman with a scar across her cheek, a grandmother with silver hair, and 2 brothers barely old enough to shave. Foley laid out 7 visas on the table, their edges illuminated by the faint glow of a lantern. "You will leave before sunrise," he said, rolling up his sleeves. He began drawing a route with a pencil stub, each line deliberate, each arrow a promise. But this is too risky," the scholar murmured. They are watching borders more closely now. Foley paused, then looked around the room. Yes. It is dangerous. But staying is more so. And if the price of doing what is right is danger, then we must pay it. The tailor swallowed hard. The grandmother wiped her eyes. The violinist nodded slowly, as though hearing courage in some silent melody. Foley stood. I will walk you part of the way, he added. To ensure you are not followed. The young woman looked up sharply. Sir, if they catch you. Well, Foley said with a gentle smile, let's see that they don't, shall we? He was not reckless. He simply understood that some risks were unacceptable not to take. And so he escorted them through back alleys, his footsteps silent, his senses sharp as the pre-dawn darkness shrouded Berlin. Every shadow was a possible threat. Every distant dog bark made hearts skip. But Foley never hesitated. He led them like a guardian spirit, unseen but unwavering. When they reached the final safe point, he spoke softly. Follow the plan exactly. Do not stop. Do not look back. They nodded. One of the brothers whispered, Thank you, sir. Foley placed a hand on his shoulder. Live well, he said. That will be thanks enough. And that? That was another night where he walked alone back to his quarters, knowing full well that a single mistake could cost him his life. But Foley was not thinking of himself. He thought only of the people he had helped. He thought of the lives that might yet bloom from the seeds he planted. Children who might grow into adults. Families who might find peace in distant lands. Future generations who would never know his name. And perhaps that humility, that willingness to erase himself from the story, was what made him extraordinary. The air of Berlin had grown heavier, as if the very sky sensed the tightening cruelty below it. Lines outside the consulate stretched longer. Fear deepened. Suspicion sharpened. And through it all, Foley walked with that same calm, deliberate stride, the stride of a man who knew each morning might be his last in that city, yet rose to meet the day regardless. There was a particular winter that tested him more than any other. A winter so bitter that frost clung to window panes like pale hands, refusing to let go. Coal became scarce. People burned furniture to keep warm. But nothing, not even the cold, chilled the heart as much as the tightening grip of oppression. Foley could feel the noose drawing in. He saw the shift in the way officials glanced at his paperwork. He caught small conversations abruptly ending when he approached. He noticed officers lingering a little too long near the consulate entrance. He understood very well what it meant. Discovery was no longer a distant possibility, it was a shadow walking beside him. But still. He continued. One morning, before dawn, he sat at his desk, his small lamp casting a warm circle of light across stacks of documents. The rest of the city was silent. It was his sacred hour, a time when the world was quiet enough to let him think. And that morning, a file lay open before him that made his breath catch. A family of 6. All of them denied. No sponsors. No funds. No political connections. Nothing but desperation. Under every regulation, every law, every policy, these papers should have been stamped, refused. Foley closed the file gently, almost reverently. Well, he murmured to himself, we shall simply have to create a path where none exists. He reached for fresh forms, his pen gliding across them with practiced steadiness. He added employment notes, created sponsorship references, filled the margins with justification, none of it fabricated in malice, but constructed to reflect a truth the law refused to see. That these people deserved to live. By the time the sun rose, he had 6 visas ready. He sat back, rubbing his tired eyes. Outside, the city stirred, unaware of the quiet miracle that had taken place under the dim light of a desk lamp. Word of his kindness spread further, though always carefully whispered. People traveled hundreds of miles because they had heard, through untraceable chains, anonymous tips, half-spoken rumors, of a British officer who risked everything to help strangers. Not all made it to him. But those who did, he did not turn away. There was a man named Adler, a historian, with ink-stained fingertips and a soft voice that trembled when he spoke. He arrived at the consulate shaking, clutching only a battered briefcase filled with notes and manuscripts. "My life's work," he said, opening the case with trembling hands. "These are the histories of our people. If I die, they vanish. Everything I've written, every story, gone." Foley listened quietly. He thumbed through one notebook, seeing sketches, timelines, fragments of memory written with devotion. "You have children?" Foley asked. "A daughter," Adler whispered. "She is 10. She is bright. Too bright to grow up in fear." Foley nodded slowly, then stood. "Come," he said, gesturing toward his office. He sat Adler down. Completed his forms. Prepared his visa. Stamped it with finality. Adler stared at it as though it were a holy relic. "But I have no money for travel. No sponsors." Foley leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Take your daughter. Leave tonight. I will handle the rest." Tears streamed down Adler's face. Not the kind born of sorrow, no. The kind born of a sudden, overwhelming mercy. And 1 week later, Adler and his daughter crossed into safety. Years afterward, that little girl grew up to become a noted scholar herself, her father's legacy preserved because one man chose to care. Foley's work, however, did not go unnoticed forever. The Gestapo began investigating more rigorously. They reviewed visa records. Compared lists. A pattern emerged: hundreds of Jewish families had escaped through British documentation. The finger began to point toward his office. And yet Foley continued his work with that same calm diligence, even as the walls tightened. One evening, when the cold wind howled down Wilhelmstrasse like some ancient omen, Foley was stopped by a German intelligence officer. A tall man. Black coat. Eyes pale as chipped ice. "Mr. Foley," he said smoothly, stepping into his path. "We have received reports. Unusual activity. Too many visas issued. Too many disappearances." Foley adjusted his gloves, his expression politely blank. "Well, when circumstances deteriorate," he replied mildly, "people do tend to leave." The officer's gaze sharpened. "Some might argue they are being helped." Foley gave a small, thoughtful nod. "If they are," he said, "I should hope it is someone very wise indeed." The officer stepped closer. "We will be watching you." Foley gave a gentle smile. "I would expect no less," he replied simply. And then, without a single tremor, he continued on his way, as if an accusation from the most feared police force in Europe were merely a passing drizzle. But he knew what it meant. Time was running short. In the midst of this tightening scrutiny, there came a moment that defined the very core of Foley's courage. A man arrived at the consulate late one afternoon. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut. He limped toward Foley's desk, gripping the edge to keep himself upright. "My wife," he said hoarsely. "They took her. Last night. I escaped. I don't know how, but I did." The room fell silent. Foley rose from his chair and guided the man to sit. "Tell me everything," he said. The man explained through cracked breaths that his wife had been taken to a local holding facility, a place known for cruelty. His voice broke as he spoke her name, each syllable heavy with fear. Foley listened without interruption. When the man finished, he looked up at Foley with hollow eyes. "Please, if she is not freed today, tomorrow will be too late." Foley did not hesitate. He grabbed his coat. "Stay here," he said. He walked out, directly into the lair of the people hunting him. The holding facility was a grim block of stone and iron. A place where hope rarely entered. Stale air. Cold floors. Guards who had forgotten softness. Foley arrived with the confidence of a man who had every right to be there. He strode through the doors, demanding to see the commander. When the commander appeared, Foley slammed his credentials onto the table. "I require the release of a detainee," he said loudly, as if the request were standard procedure. The commander scoffed. "This is not your jurisdiction." Foley leaned closer. "Then perhaps you would like to explain to your superiors why the British government is being denied access to someone we may have reason to question." It was a bluff. A daring, extraordinary bluff. The commander hesitated. Bureaucrats fear mistakes more than evil. Finally, with a scowl, he ordered the woman brought forward. She was bruised, exhausted, barely able to stand. Foley walked to her, placed his arm firmly around her shoulders, and guided her out past the guards, each one too uncertain to challenge him. Only when they reached the street did he let his breath tremble. He had saved her, by sheer force of will. That woman would later say, "He walked into hell and led me out as calmly as a man leaving church." And that was Foley. A man who risked everything, every day, without ever asking for thanks. Eventually, the war crept closer. Berlin darkened further. The city crackled with tension, suspicion, and fear. But Foley continued issuing visas until the very moment he was ordered to leave the country. Even then, he spent his final hours in Berlin signing as many documents as he possibly could, his pen moving with tireless urgency. When he finally departed, the vice-consul later found hundreds of approved visas on his desk, left there like seeds waiting to take root. And thousands upon thousands of lives would grow from those seeds. Years passed. The war ended. The world tried to rebuild. And Frank Foley, he returned to a quiet life, never speaking publicly of what he had done. He retired in Somerset, living modestly, tending his garden, walking his dog. There were no medals on his wall. No ego. No pride. He kept his heroism quietly folded inside himself, like a letter never intended to be opened. Many of the people he saved never knew his name. Many of their children never knew the face of the man who gave them life. Generations grew, unaware that their existence hinged on the quiet bravery of a single British officer who refused to let paperwork become a death sentence. Only years later, long after his passing, did the world begin to uncover the magnitude of his deeds. Historians pieced together testimonies. Families searched archives. Stories emerged of a man who stood alone against the machinery of destruction, armed with nothing but a stamp, a steady hand, and a conscience that refused to bend. Israel honored him. Survivors spoke his name with reverence. And the world finally learned what he had done. But had he been alive to hear the praise, he would have simply waved it away and said something modest like, "I did only what any decent man should do." Because that was Frank Foley. A quiet giant. A humble guardian. A man who saved thousands, not by shouting, not by fighting, not by standing in the spotlight, but by working in the shadows with the gentlest heart you could ever imagine. And to this day, the world is fuller, richer, more alive. Because a soft-spoken man in a simple overcoat walked into darkness with nothing but compassion as his lantern. And so, as we reach the end of this long journey through the life of Frank Foley, let us take a gentle breath, and let the story settle in our heads. For his legacy is not only a chapter in history. It is a reminder to each of us that quiet courage still matters. That decency, even when unseen, still changes lives. That a single compassionate choice, made in silence, can ripple outward in ways we may never fully know. Foley walked into danger not because he sought recognition, but because he believed in the simple, stubborn power of doing what is right. And perhaps that is the lesson we can carry with us now. That greatness often appears in ordinary clothing. In a steady voice. In a calm decision to help someone who cannot repay the kindness. As you step back into your own life, I hope you carry with you a little of that quiet bravery. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the steady, everyday sort. The kind that listens. The kind that lifts. The kind that stands firm when others step away. You may never know whose life you'll touch, whose hope you'll restore, or whose path you'll brighten simply by choosing kindness when it would be easier not to. So go gently. Go steadily. And know that the world is always changed. Not by those who shout the loudest, but by those who care the most. And if ever you wonder whether goodness still has a place in this world, remember this quiet man from Somerset, who proved that even in the darkest of times, one person's compassion can open doors and save countless lives.